Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Fuller Kamara. Today we're in chapter 48, closing the books, protecting your work. When you or your client finish reviewing a financial period, you will want to lock it to prevent changes. Problem can arise if transactions are added, deleted, or change after the books are closed. QuickBooks Online allows you to close your client's books at any frequency you prefer. You can set a closing date or even a password to protect and prevent changes after you close the books. Any changes made to the company file after you close the books will be logged. You can run an exception to closing date report to see changes. Closing the books isn't a year-end process. You or your client can close their books at any frequency. Some clients prefer to do it each month after they've completed any reconciliations. However, the books should be closed at least each year end after the tax returns have been filed to finalize all account balances and lock down the books. Before you can close the books, you need to do the following. First of all, you need to reconcile all bank and credit card accounts. If you don't know how to reconcile bank accounts, please watch our reconciliation tutorial. Then you also need to substantiate all balance sheet account balances. In other words, look for things other than bank and credit card account. For example, look at the loan balances and asset values on the balance sheet. Then also you need to review the values on each row of the profit and loss report and ensure they are correct for the period being reviewed. So now to close the books, we have several ways to access closing the books in QuickBooks Online. So the more straightforward method is to select the accountant tools and close the books. You can also access the close the books from the book review from the client's account, and then on the left navigation you can see books review. So once you click the books review, you go to wrap up, then you also have the option to close the books from there. So you can also access the close the books from the gear icon. So once you click the gear icon, you can go to account and settings, advanced, and select from the accounting, you can select close the book. So these are the various ways to access the close the books. So now to close the books, you can just click on close the books and turn this slider on. Then you can select the date. So let's say we are going to close the books for October 31st. So now we can either choose to password protect or just allow changes after viewing a warning. So for this tutorial, we're just going to allow changes after viewing a warning, but in real life we need to password protect. If we select password protect, you can enter the password. So if you put in the password of your choice, whenever someone wants to enter a transaction, they would have to enter the password first before they can post that transaction. However, for us, we'll just select to allow changes after viewing a warning. So we click save. So after we've clicked save, now we click done. So now we've closed the books for October. Please note that whenever you are setting up a date, it is best to create or update a closing date when your client is fairly certain that all the day-to-day transactions for that period have been entered. So you don't want to put in a date that you know for sure that your client is still working on adding more transaction or making changes to existing transaction. So you want to be sure that the date that you put in as the closing date is actually a date that the client would have already posted all the necessary transactions. And also the close period also applies to non-posting transactions such as estimates and purchase orders. If you create estimates and purchase orders after the closing date, you will also have the exceptions to the closing period for that. Also note that reconciliations can be conducted in the closed period without having to enter a password. So what we're saying is now we know our closing date is actually 10/31st, 2023. So if we go to do a reconciliation, let's say our reconciliation is 10/30, 2023. So we can still do our reconciliation without having to worry about like the warning. As you can see, our reconciliation here is the October 30, 2023. So even though we put in October 30, 2023, we're still able to do our reconciliation without having to worry about the warning. If we have entered a transaction to QuickBooks Online that is dated maybe October 30, 2023, we would get a warning because that date was before the closing date. So let's say, for example, let's just enter one expense transaction. Let's say in this case, Destiny. So the date, let's say we know our closing date was October 31st. Let's say our date is October 30. And now we have cash, email marketing. And let's just click save and close. Because the date we've entered is actually before the closing date, we got this message. Because we've choose to get a warning, that's the reason why we're just getting the warning. So this warning says this transaction was on or before your company's closing date. Using this date will affect your books. Are you sure you want to save? So we say yes. So we can still save this transaction. So even though QuickBooks allow us to save the transaction, we still have an exception to this because of this entry that we've entered, which is after the closing date. So now we have an exception report because of that. Users with correct permissions can edit or delete transactions after the closing date and after the books have been closed. In this situation, QuickBooks Online will do two things. First, QuickBooks Online will display a warning asking the users to enter the closing date password. That is, if we've protected the closing date with a password, QuickBooks will also log the change in the exception to closing date report. The exceptions to the closing date report list all changes made to transactions before and including the closing date. The reports allow you to track if any changes are made, regardless of whether the books are password protected or not. Once you set the closing date, you can access the report through the report center in the For My Accountant. So if we go to the report, because now we've added a closing date. So if there was no closing date, the exception to closing date report will not be available. But because we've added a closing date, now that report will be available. So now you can see the exception to closing date. So if we click on that, the exception to closing date is actually a filtered version of the audit log. So these are the exceptions to the closing date. So you can see who made the changes, the transaction ID, and then the last modify. You can see the time and the date when the entry was made. So you can see all these entries. You can see some that are system entries. So if I click on view the history, you can see the transactions that were recorded after the closing date. So now you have the option to save this. So if you want to save this, you can just click the printer icon. So once you click the printer icon, then you can select save as PDF. So once you select that, you will be able to save it to your location of choice. So now I'm not going to save, I'll just cancel. This report is only available because we have selected a closing date. So if I go to account and settings and go to advanced and now select a closing date, then I turn off this close the books. So let me just save. So now if I go back to reports and go to my accountant report, even though we know the name, we can search, but I just wanted to show you how for my accountant. So these are the reports for my accountant. So you see the exceptions to closing date report is no longer available. Even if we search, we say, you see, so this report is no longer available because we've turned off the closing date. The report will only be available after we've turned on the closing date. So let's go back to account and settings and let me just turn on the closing date. So let's go back to October 31st is our closing date. So now let's go back to the report. So you see, so exception to the closing date report is now available because we've set a closing date. If we change the date, let's say if we change our closing dates, let's go to accountant, close the books. So now let's just change this date. Instead of 12/31st, let's just change this date to 10. Instead of 10/31st 2023, let's just change it to 10/25 2023 and save. So now let's go back to the report and see if you will be able to see those transactions. So let's say exception. So you see, so we have the exceptions to the closing date. So you see, these are the exceptions. So now we still have these exceptions here. So this is how to close the books and how to run exceptions to the closing date as well. And that's the end of chapter 48. I wanted to take a moment to express my deepest gratitude to my subscribers for their support and enthusiasm throughout our QuickBooks Online tutorial series. It is with a great pleasure that we now wrap up the final chapter of this educational adventure. From the very beginning, our goal was to demystify the world of QuickBooks Online and empower you with the knowledge and skills to navigate its intricacies with ease. We hope that we have succeeded in providing you with valuable insights, practical tips, and actionable guidance that will truly transform the way you manage and interact with QuickBooks Online. Once again, thank you for joining us on this educational adventure. Your enthusiasm and commitment have made it truly a remarkable experience. I am immensely grateful for your trust and look forward to bringing you more valuable content in the future. And thank you for watching. See you in the next video.